AI has been around for a long time, right? Everyone's talking about it. Everyone feels like they're not doing enough. And this is the conversation that we're often having with publications that I work with.
For a while now, everybody's been talking about AI, but when you actually sit down with Newsroom, where do they tend to begin?
So last year I had the opportunity, as part of my work at FT Strategies, we designed this program called the AI Launchpad. So at that time, what I did was I created this framework that was all about helping news companies think about first their business. So forget AI for a second. We sort of simplified that into three big buckets. The first was...
Today's guest is Aliya Itzkowitz from FT Strategies, a sharp mind at the intersection of journalism, AI, and newsroom innovation. We dive into where AI is actually making a difference, how to scale experiments, and what Newsroom should really be focusing on next.
I was becoming increasingly conscious of the challenges that were facing our industry.
I imagine sort of the question pops up pretty quickly. Should we build this ourselves or just bring in a vendor?
This is such a key question. I actually wrote a report about this, which is exactly on this build versus buy question.
At some point, the question changes, right? It's not longer what can we try, but what actually works.
Now that it's sort of like the dust is settling and we're asking more questions about what's really going to be game-changing and what's really adding value.
So it feels like for a while now, everybody's been talking about AI, and it's really the big buzzword, especially in the news industry as well. But mostly at a very high level, I'm really curious, when you actually sit down with Newsroom, where do they tend to begin?
Definitely. It's funny because AI has been around for a long time, right? But then in the last 2 years, ever since generative AI came along, everyone's talking about it. Everyone feels like they're not doing enough. And this is the conversation that we're often having with publications that I work with. In terms of how we tend to approach it, that's kind of one question. And then another question is how I often find people are approaching it when I first meet them. So maybe I'll start there. Like when I often meet a news publication at this point in time, I think a lot of people have been experimenting quite heavily for the last 1.5 years at least. So I think the question on people's mind recently is, how do I take a step back from all that experimentation that sort of just began during all this hype and excitement? And how do I now take a step back from that and evaluate what's really working and what's making a difference to my business? When I was working very closely with a lot of publications last year, I can tell you also a bit about how we approached it with them. So last year I had the opportunity, as part of my work at FT Strategies, we designed this program with the Google News initiative called the AI Launchpad. And at that time, the market was in a slightly different place, actually. And I think it was more a question of people were just beginning to experiment. So at that time, what I did was I created this framework that was all about helping news companies think about first their business. So forget AI for a second. Let's just think about what are the key stages in a news business's operations and existence. So we sort of simplified that into three big buckets. The first was, what is your news operation, essentially? So how are you finding the news to write about? How are you then writing that in a very practical way within the newsroom? And I think that's the logical place where a lot of newsrooms have started their experimentation, especially just given that generative AI is really what is new and exciting. So that has meant that a lot of the emphasis has been on the content creation side. But then we also moved on to the second bucket, which was, how do you then take that content and engage audiences with it? And I think that's where we've seen a lot of really exciting experimentation in the last year, especially. So, you know, chatbots are one example of that, but so is this concept of kind of liquid content. You know, I can take a story, but then I can repackage it the way you want. How do you want your news? Do you want it in a summary? Do you want it in a format that's personal to you? So that's where all this kind of repackaging, text to speech, and sort of shape shifting comes into place. And then the final bucket is monetization. And I think it was interesting because when we started the program, this was sometimes a little bit neglected, I think, because it was perhaps less sexy, less new, or people, oh yes, we have been looking at churn models for some time now, and maybe less exciting initially. But I think now, and many of my colleagues who subsequently ran this program with other publishers, that began to be a bigger and bigger question. So how is this actually going to help me monetize my content better or retain users better? Can I now use dynamic paywalling, or can I use perhaps AI for my advertising business as well? What's the future of SEO with generative search and these kind of questions coming more and more, perhaps less initially creative, but very important ones. So that's the kind of third and final bucket. And then kind of overarching all of this, we also had these, you'll see in the framework, there are sort of these rings that go around the outside, which is governance, making sure that you have a solid foundation and process that's underpinning all of this experimentation. So those are sort of the broad approach that we took with our clients on that program, and that I think provided a bit of structure and a place to start in what was quite a confusing space in the beginning.
I really believe in sort of like process and framework, and I really know that FT strategies are the masters when it comes to this. But before we sort of jump into sort of the AI and the newsrooms, a lot to start with you. Like the question, who are you and what brought you into sort of journalism and the media world?
Yes, so it's interesting. I've been working now for almost a decade, which is not that long, but I have had a number of different careers already, actually, which I think is becoming more and more common in our generation. So I actually started off my career working in a bank in financial markets. Then I kind of got interested in the markets. And that's what got me into journalism, because my job was essentially about storytelling and what was happening in the markets, but from a research standpoint. Then I started working as a journalist at Bloomberg, actually, initially in TV. And that was a lot of fun. I was essentially in a control room helping to write scripts for the anchor about what was happening that day in financial markets. And it was great fun. And after that, I actually worked at a tech company. So we have something in common there, tech for newsrooms. So not sure if you've heard of a company called Data Miner, but I was working there. And that's interesting because that's an AI company that, in a sense, was working in AI before this latest wave of AI. And so from there, I came to FT Strategies. And it was interesting. I think the reason I found FT Strategies is I was, having worked in news and then having worked in tech for news companies, I was becoming increasingly conscious of the challenges that were facing our industry and curious about how to solve them. So then I came across this new consultancy that the Financial Times was setting up. I think at the time there were about 20 people working here. And I just reached out to someone and sort of said, this is my passion, is the news industry, and I want to make sure it survives. And I think that resonated, and here I am, almost 4 years later.
That's a fantastic sort of also mission statement to make sure it survives. And how do you go about in FT Strategies of helping publishers, what should we say, almost rethink how they work to then set them towards the right direction?
For sure. I think one of the things that I liked when I found out about us is that we have this sort of, we've been there, we know the challenges. And in the case of AI, it's not even we've been there, it's we are there. We are also working through the same challenges as many of our clients. So I think that's kind of where we start always in our projects is from that place of empathy, because any kind of transformation project requires that understanding and explaining people, we know this is not easy because we've done this and made our fair share of mistakes as well along the way. So kind of having that humility and empathy in the beginning. And then in the beginning, I think when I started working here, a lot of our work was around sort of taking the playbook that we knew had worked at the FT and then translating that to the context of another newspaper or another magazine or any media company, really. And at that time, a lot of the emphasis was on, helping people rethink their revenue models. For example, launching subscriptions, etc. I think what's changed in the last year or so, what was really fascinating getting to design that AI program I mentioned, was that we don't have the playbook already. We are also building it. So that was a really interesting and unique challenge. And I was almost getting to chat in real time with my colleagues in product and tech and learning about what they were looking at almost on a weekly basis, because as you know, this space is moving so quickly. Information becomes stale very quickly as well. So having that feedback loop internally and with peers in the industry has been super helpful.
I can resonate with that. What we're doing today will be completely different tomorrow, and the speed of how things are going is just massive. I wonder, is there this moment when you look across the work you've done with Newsroom, and also given your sort of background on tech and working in the Newsroom, where you then sort of realize, let's wait. We've been trying all these different things, but have we ever really taken a step back to look at the full picture? And I like that about like the 3-step that you guys did with the Google initiative. It's sort of like, let's look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's very true. In the sense that I often think that is our role when I'm working with a company. It's like it's a luxury that you have that different perspective, right? Because when you're in it and you're in your day-to-day, you don't have time, first of all, often to zoom out and think about that bigger picture, because there's always something that you have to do today. And we work in the news business, so it is literally by the minute often that it's like, I need this story now. This has just happened. So time works differently in news business, right? And it's hard to think about what's going to happen tomorrow, leave alone where do you want to be in 5 years, which is often what we ask people when we're working on a North Star strategy with them or something like that. So absolutely, I think that having that ability to stop and zoom out is huge. And in the context of what we are discussing, so all of the AI experimentation, for instance, something that we found with quite a few of the companies last year, and we are 100% guilty of this too, is you notice a lot of duplication of effort, duplication of experimentation, because different departments might not be talking to each other. Maybe one department's experimenting with a vendor and so is another, or looking at creating some functionality in-house and not knowing that there's something they can already leverage. And this happens a lot in bigger organizations, in my experience. So having that ability to zoom out and sort of take stock of all the activities that are going on across your organization is a view that's sometimes missing and very much needed, I think, to kind of align on AI experimentation going forward.
Very often when I consult, and also in the sales process of course being on the vendor side, it's very often I see some publisher made a lot of thought, like the steps that you did 1, 2, 3 at FD strategy, or thinking how do we go about it. But if you're a publisher thinking about trying, testing and using AI, is it sort of then easier just to go like with tools like a vendor is then providing? Or is that sort of the right place to start? Or should you really be looking at something more fundamental, like the way that you said the 3-way steps that you worked with them? What's the right direction to go?
So the reason we approached it in those steps of first looking at your business and your business activities is because we're trying to get away from this mindset of we need to use AI, where can we use AI in our business? Which is a little bit backwards, right? Because the question should be, I have these problems I want to solve, or I have these goals. how can AI help me reach them or solve the problems in front of me? So that was the logic behind starting with each part of your business, looking in depth at the processes that you're already doing, and then thinking, what could we do differently? And equally thinking about things that you don't already do or that don't exist that you now have to start thinking about. But I think to your point about the vendors, they certainly come into the picture in our methodology. For instance, like once you've worked out the area in which you want to play, essentially, then comes the time to sort of look out in the market and say, okay, I want help with comment moderation, or I want to use AI to help me with churn. And then you go out and see what are the vendors playing in this space that can help me solve this problem. Of course, sometimes things organically happen the other way, right? So we work in the news business, we often talk with our peers. So maybe someone hears about a tool that someone else is using and thinks, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to experiment with that too. But the reason we designed it the other way was sort of to get away from this like hammer in search of a nail problem, as we sometimes call it as a team.
I like that way of doing it, because also if you start in a process, for example, with a vendor, having done these sort of things and having understanding of what their needs are, their processes, really helps also to facilitate, okay, what value you're getting here. But I'm sort of, once the publishers start exploring these specific AI ideas in the process, I imagine sort of the question pops up pretty quickly. Should we build this ourselves or just bring in a vendor in that case? You surely sort of get that also in the way that you help them to facilitate vendors or so on. What do you experience in this way?
This is such a key question. I actually wrote a report about this, which is exactly on this build versus buy question. And of course, build versus buy is not a new question in our industry, but there are some nuances with AI that change that conversation. So what I mean by that is we all know, for instance, that sometimes if you buy something, you can move faster. That's not necessarily particular to AI, but that is often true. And for instance, the fact that if you try to do something internally, this sometimes favors bigger organizations, better resourced organizations. So these things remain true, and these things are not unique to AI. But I think what I have noticed regarding the conversation around AI is some nuances. So a big point here is around data and the control of data in an AI world. So I've worked with organizations, for example, who say, we are so keen to maintain control of our IP and our data. And of course, that's something that affects both build and buy, because even if you're building in-house, that's going to be important to you in terms of the models that you use, and those are still going to come from external companies. But some companies, large organizations in particular, may choose to prioritize that, or say, we want to keep all our content in a walled garden environment, and that's really important to us. Whereas I've worked with smaller companies who sort of say, this isn't the most important thing in the world to us. What's more important to us is moving fast, being able to iterate quickly. So that's one point that I think is kind of like a newer aspect to the conversation. The other reason why people may do things in-house, which I think is sort of unique to where we are now, is honestly just for the learning and capability building alone. So I'm not sure if you've come across Uli Kopen from Bayerische Rundfunk, but she calls this the Trojan unicorn, which I absolutely love as an analogy. And the idea there is like the real value of the in-house project is actually the learning that your teams get. So this was 100% the case. Last year, we worked with a large financial newspaper in Bulgaria. The project that they did with us was quite impressive. They were extremely ambitious and learned very quickly. So they received mentorship from one of my colleagues in the FT product team to roll out quite quickly a summarization capability in their CMS. And when I reflected back on the project, though, it it was so much also about what they learned, and that for them was a big part of the value of having worked with us. So I think the capability building piece can be a reason why someone chooses to do it themselves. On the buy side, why might you work with a vendor? I think the key thing that is sort of unique to the conversation with AI is the point around flexibility and the danger of perhaps moving too quickly. So one example that we use with our clients a lot when we're illustrating this point, not that it was a failure, but if you recall, Bloomberg was very quick to market with its Bloomberg GPT, and then the tech moved on very quickly, right? So that's sometimes an example that we mention as kind of like a cautionary tale of like, what if you build something in-house, but you sort of get tied down to one model or one technology that then maybe becomes obsolete. So this kind of modularity and flexibility that you get sometimes by working with vendors and getting to experiment faster, try things, keep things, move on from things, that's a big advantage in the current landscape.
I had the first episode on this podcast with Lars Jensen, who is do very much focus on the audience in Berlingske in Denmark. And at that conversation, we're talking a lot about how they went about, for example, with going about understanding the content and user needs, which is very popular these days. But he talks a lot about like if you automate something, you're also in the fear of missing something out. There's, of course, wins. But then one example here is, for example, you also want your journalist maybe to then be able to articulate what sort of story is this. And by automating it, you might not do the right thing. So my point is that I think that maybe it's not always either or, buy versus build. There must be sort of also ways that trying something to build yourself is a learning path into going with something. But you also have to have the question about like automating it. What do we get out from it? So I sort of think that you can, of course, also then start with something off the shelf first in a smart way to sort of before committing to build something. But my question is that it really depends on what we're trying to solve and the first question. And are there certain types of problems where building just makes more sense in this case instead of buying?
Yes, definitely. I think that try before you buy is a very important part of the process. And you mentioned sort of the potential risk of automating things too quickly, and that meaning that maybe your team misses out on that learning. So I think absolutely part of that trial experience is also about educating your team. So by trying something, you can first validate, is this the right use case for AI in our organization? But then you can also use that opportunity to see how your teams respond to working with AI, see how they're learning from the process. And that is equally as important in a way. And then they're also able to tweak their workflows accordingly, because that's a huge part of it, right? Is not just acquiring a tool, but also how are you going to embed that effectively in your workflows, or maybe you need to change your workflows to accommodate that new tool in some way.
It's one area that sort of we do quite a bit in Kilkaya is focusing on an AI and personalization of the front page. And again, here it's the part where you can, of course, go with vendor or building solutions, which sort of has sort of almost like a black box where it's testing constantly to get the most clicks out of the articles. However, I think that it's a part there also to have like the journalistic integrity, because if an editor-in-chief can't explain how the model works, the biggest currency in this industry, I said it again and again on the podcast, trust is the new currency here. I think also being able to articulate how the AI works becomes really, really important here. I want to sort of come back to also like on the buy part. It's like you mentioned a couple of these things, but what kind of things would you make lean towards buying instead? Is it sort of like, as you mentioned, speed, or are there other factors at play in this case?
I would say the main ones that come up are speed, cost, and flexibility. And the flexibility point is really key, because I think there is a fear of moving too quickly. Actually, there's a fear people have of moving too slowly with AI, but equally sort of rushing and perhaps investing a lot in something that then becomes obsolete. So I think that's important, and I think that's why a lot of people opt for the experimentation, sort of vendor-led experimentation path, is because that affords you a lot more flexibility to very quickly get something underway, especially if you don't have large development teams in-house or you know, perhaps an enterprise agreement with some of the large AI companies. So I think that's quite key. I also remember that you asked me before around which projects are most suited to in-house. And I think my answer there is, I think if it's a project that relies very heavily on your archive, for instance, or the data that you have on your articles, or if you have, for instance, a lot of in-house systems that you've built over time. And this is something that I see more for like very much legacy players, where they have these very large archives that are often not in a great state. So that's a huge kind of internal opportunity, I think, often that I see. Although I do know there are some companies that can help you with that sort of data taxonomy side of things as well. But those are the kind of projects that I think are often more suited to a kind of internal approach.
I want to move a little bit the conversation from sort of the hype to the impact of when AI came, because when AI started becoming a really, really hot topic in the media, and you said it's been around for quite a long, but it became really, really big at the point. It felt like a lot of people rushed into sort of experimentation, maybe just even to be able to say they were doing something in order to do it. Like, what's your perspective from those that you've been working with in terms of like the boom in the beginning and how they went about it?
There was definitely a lot of pressure. And I think when we designed this program, that was part of our desire, was to help people get out of that paralysis of feeling, oh my gosh, everyone is suddenly pressuring us to use AI and we don't know where to begin, and we want to get this right. We don't want to rush in, damage our reputation, do something wrong in a reader-facing way. So I think there was a lot of anxiety initially, and everyone felt, I'm not doing enough. And as you say, I think a lot of organizations did have some version of a KPI that was just like, we need to use AI this year. We don't know what for, but
spaghetti on the wall. Let's see what sticks.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that was absolutely the case last year. And I think now most organizations are already, I think a lot of the use cases that we were experimenting with last year have become sort of business as usual in some organizations. Like many organizations now are doing headline testing or using AI for SEO, or you name it. But I think a lot of these things that initially seemed risky are now becoming BAU. So I think that's one thing. In terms of sort of like where is that going now, with the kind of pressure and panic almost that we felt in the beginning, I think now that sort of like the dust is settling and we're asking more questions about what's really going to be game changing and what's really adding value. So in a sense, a lot of these initial use cases, as I mentioned before, many publications are now doing them. If somebody does something and it works, we usually hear about it quite quickly at a conference, and then everyone starts doing it too. So the question is now, like, what's really providing a return on investment to the business, and how is AI maybe more fundamentally going to change business models or the way we engage with audiences? So I think some of those bigger questions are now on people's minds.
This was exactly sort of what I was just thinking about this, because at some point the question changes, right? It's not longer what can we try, but what actually works. You must see sort of this shift happening in that case, that is going towards that direction at this point.
Absolutely. What actually works, and one of the challenges that we often find with our clients is, and internally here as well at the FT, it's really hard to measure the impact of some of these internal use cases. So, whereas if you create a new reader-facing product, you can measure, are we attracting new audience? Are we increasing engagement on our website, or are we monetizing better in some way?
Are we saving time internally, multiple?
Exactly. That's a bit harder. That is harder to measure, because if every person in your organization is saving a little bit of time on a certain workflow, how does that all trickle up or flow up into a much larger and meaningful cost save, time save for your organization? I think that's a bigger question, and we're in the process actually of working with some of our colleagues in the data and product team here at the FT to sort of think about a framework that we can apply to really measure that in a more rigorous way. We have a lot of good data and progress around kind of AI fluency and people using the tools that we have, but it's harder for us to then prove that this is really helping them to do their job better or faster.
I'm just very super curious on this, because you must have a lot of understanding on this. And when you're looking at whether an AI experiment was successful, sort of one thing is on the measurement. What sort of questions are useful to ask yourself in order to get if it was successful or not?
So one of the things that we usually do, so for instance, last year, I worked on a project like this with a Dutch company. And what we did was we actually created a bespoke framework for them of like, what is value in an AI experiment for you? So on the individual level, there would be a goal for the experiment, right? So that we always do in our work, in the sense of we always set a time limit and a goal so that we know if something worked or not. So it might be, we want to see X% more engagement on this by, in the next 3 months. So that we always do. But what I mean by a framework is we actually took a step back and we said, like, what is a successful use of AI for you? Like, does this need to generate revenue? Does this need to save money? But beyond that as well, we included a lot of other factors. So I mentioned before the educational factor. So that was one. It was like, did this experiment upskill my team, or did we learn how to use a new tool, or did we learn how to work with a model that we'd never worked with before, or something like that. So there was educational aspect to it, and there were others as well. So I think from memory, we also had quite a few around, is this helping me pivot my business model for the future? Because that was one of their objectives as well. It wasn't just about doing things faster or better. It was also supposed to help them like fundamentally shift what their business was about. And in the context of AI, a lot of us should be thinking about this, and we should probably be thinking about it more, actually.
This is music. This is music to my ears, because it shouldn't always be just about saving time or money. It's sort of just as valuable what the project teaches the team here and how it helps them build capabilities for the future. Exactly.
And I think with the how is this preparing me for the future question, which was a really interesting one, that I think is often something that we don't think about enough. So if I think about the program that we designed last year, we had a lot of really interesting discussions with publishers about this. In practice, many of the experiments that we ran were about doing the things we already do, but better or differently, which is great. Like, that is innovation, and that is the place to start, right? But after that, we also have to consider, how is AI going to fundamentally change everything? And that's a harder conversation to have, because none of us know the answer, right? None of us have a crystal ball, but we can see the beginning of it already. Things like referrals changing, and these things are, the indications are already there, right? Of where this is all going. But I think like one example that I use there is, I mentioned before, a super popular experiment last year was like using AI for SEO headline optimization. And now it's like, okay, that's old world SEO. Is that going to matter going forward with Gen Search? So it's sort of ironic we're using the new technology, but still kind of working in our old ways. And I think that's what we need to now try to break out and move beyond.
But this is also the way reading habits is changing. The changes in the industry is constant, and it's constantly something new. But then I'm curious were there any experiments where you saw sort of where the real value sort of originally wasn't where the people expected it to be, that you ended up with something completely different?
Yes, that happens a lot. Because I mean, even in a totally different context, I think many of the best inventions have sort of been accidents, right? So let me try to think of a good example there. Kind of like an unintended consequence. I think probably one example that comes to mind is actually one of our own. So I speak quite a bit with the team behind Ask FT, which is our sort of generative search chatbot that we rolled out I think over a year ago now. But recently we rolled it out to all the professional readers of the FT. And I think what was interesting there is that people were not necessarily always using it in the way that we expected. So we thought people were going to ask it questions, very specific questions that they needed, for example, for work. And yes, a lot of people do use it that way. But equally, we had some examples of people using them to specifically look up what a journalist that they like had written recently. Or there were other examples of how people were using it, which didn't necessarily that's not what the tool was built for, right? Or equally, it's an external facing tool, but then a lot of people started using it internally as a way of searching our archive as well. So there were sort of all these unintended uses for it, which I think is interesting. And another example that comes to mind from our work last year is we did some work with El País. They were a member of the program I mentioned. And we actually worked quite a bit with Prisa Radio in that experiment. And in the beginning, the idea of the experiment was we're going to use a tool to do text-to-speech so that we can have journalists reading their own opinion pieces on a podcast, but in such a way that they only have to read a few words, and then we can just automatically get their voice and do that for them. So that was the beginning ambition, but it ended up having two completely different directions that it went in. So one was that in tandem, they were also doing this very impressive project, which Google supported them on, which was, it's called Verificaudio, and it's you may have heard of this. I think they've won some awards for it. And it was essentially a way of working out if there has been voice cloning or if a piece of audio is synthetic. And then through our work with them, they actually made that sort of, I think they found a way to kind of use our experimentation to even make their lie detector better, which was interesting because these were two completely separate projects, but sort of found a way to connect the dots between them. So in that sense, to answer your question, it's sort of like we started off with an idea, but then it became part of a totally different initiative within the same company, and using that experimentation and innovation to actually fight synthetic voice was very interesting. So it was sort of the opposite.
But it does happen, and it's always then interesting to see which turn it can take. But one thing that, having spoken with quite a bit of people having either lead for AI or the different teams, also in the conversation I've had on this podcast, is that I want to move sort of into the team around the table and who actually makes this work. And I definitely think that it is the team effort in this, but for the first episode I had with Lars Jensen at Berlinske, he almost worked as sort of like an enforcer of the user needs model to then get them to get there. Lars Adrian Gisket i Tromsø and his team really worked and was really pushing this towards what started at one brand became part of something bigger. And I really see that these kind of projects often come down to the people involved, and it's not just the tech. I even seen in my life in working in the tech industry that the tech is only successful also if you have really people using it. And what I'm asking for is what kind of roles or relationships are most important when you're trying to get AI off the ground in a newsroom?
The team is absolutely key. And I've seen some examples of how this has worked not so well and also really well. And I think what you need is, if we go back to what I said at the very beginning, I suppose the empathy point and the humility point being really key. So what you really need for a project in the newsroom to work is an empathetic and emotionally intelligent product manager that can effectively partner with editorial, listen to their concerns, listen to their taste making and the things that they really know best. And then I mentioned editorial. So you need someone from the newsroom who takes an interest in technology, who is willing to experiment and who sees the potential of this technology. So I think in the beginning, understandably, a lot of us viewed AI as a threat to our functions within our companies. And to an extent it is, but I think we also realized its shortcomings over the last couple of years. So I think because of that, and because a lot of these use cases are now becoming very normalized, there are a lot of smart, willing experimenters in newsrooms today that are very willing to be part of these working groups and see, you know, is there a way that, what does every journalist care about? Is I want people to engage with the content I'm producing because I'm producing something interesting and of value. So I think when we approach it from that angle, it's a more productive conversation always. It's like, we need to provide new formats for the up and coming generation that's going to be just AI natives, right? In the same way that we transformed to digital, we now need to transform to these AI enabled formats. And I think so that's essential, is like finding someone who takes an interest in what that audience of the future will want and that sees, okay, yes, this is the way to make my content resonate with a broader audience. And it's not just the next generation, it's also just people who are adopting tech faster today. So we had a lot of sort of these super users of AskFT who are just working people who are perhaps more interested in using Gen Search and some of the emerging formats that we're seeing today. So finding someone in the newsroom that gets that and that cares, and then finding someone from your tech team that can speak the language of the newsroom, work hand in hand with them, and is willing to iterate multiple times on projects to get it right. Because the newsroom knows what they need, but then the tech team knows if it's possible. And so getting these two things together is really the key.
Yeah, and getting people to work together, but it is still the case here that sometimes that the organization where editorial and product folks actually sit down and work together is one thing, but it's also those places where they stay in their lanes. And I want to get into it because there's a difference between, let's say, a smaller niche media or a smaller group versus a big organization. You work at the FT, for example, and I maybe would then think that there's multiple departments, multiple middle managers, and just getting people together, it ain't that easy in that case. So where have you seen sort of like working like on big organizational groups where they sort of get people? Is it just to get them together? Because I don't think that's that easy, actually.
You're right. It's not easy. And that's why often it's easier to move faster. I've worked with some small digital native organizations that can definitely get projects over the line faster and get things done. But I think when you work in a big complex organization, it's certainly harder to get things going. But when they do come together, you can make a huge impact. So that's the rewarding part. But as you say, it's not easy. And we've already iterated several times on this sort of internal structures that we have, whether it's the way that our AI task force is working or the way that people, our tech colleagues, are embedded in certain projects. And in the beginning, like many organizations, sort of actually decided to spin out a dedicated AI team because AI felt so mission critical at that point. That was a way of sort of accelerating that. And in fact, the team here at the FT was actually called Accelerate AI. So the whole idea was like, we need a bespoke team for this now because it's so important now. And now that team is being further embedded actually just across multiple projects. So we no longer really even call it the AI team. It's now becoming part of everything that we do. But that was one way of kind of getting things moving faster. And that's something that I've seen a lot of the companies that we've worked with as well. So one of the other companies that was in the program last year was Tamedia from Switzerland, and they have a dedicated AI hub. And we were working closely with Nadia, who leads that hub. So some organizations, big organizations, decided, okay, the way we can really get this going is to create a point person and a dedicated team. Whereas others may have gone for more of this embedded model that we've moved more towards now. And they all have their strengths and weaknesses. I think, it's a little bit like data, where the danger when you have a dedicated team is people think it's not their problem and they sort of view it as data as a service, or, oh, I'll just go to those guys when I need data help or service. But I think that with the embedded model, there's more accountability, but there's also more complexity, to your point.
I think it's not necessarily just to have, like, the secret is to have like a huge AI team, which is then specific. I mean, you pointed on it. It comes down to the collaboration between teams on this, but I'm thinking constantly about like, how do you scale this? One thing is I completely agree with you. Smaller newsroom, I think, can move way faster and way more way of experimentation. But when you come to these bigger organizational heavy newsrooms, sometimes I keep wondering about how these experimentations can grow. And the one example that I mentioned was, for example, with Tromsø and the Gin AI tool, which then sort of ranks the newsworthiness of municipalities. That started at one of the regional newspapers, and I grew to become part of the bigger setup. And is it sometimes maybe easier to start with a small part of the business, a focus test, and then try to scale it across the organization?
Yes, I think it is. I think it certainly can be. And also because if you think on a brand level, so, for instance, maybe a big organization that has multiple titles. I mentioned before, like, it's so important for you to identify the problem you're trying to solve or the need. So that's much easier to do at a brand specific level. And if I think about some of the organizations I've worked with the last couple of years, let's say you're a large conglomerate and you have a lot of regional newspapers or something like that. You're going to have some problems that are shared across the whole organization, but you're also going to have some things that are really unique to that particular title. Maybe the audience and the value proposition is different. So I think especially those kind of content-centric experiments makes a lot of sense for those content and audience projects to begin on a title-specific level. Then you can validate the concept on a smaller scale. It's like what we were saying before about experimentation. You start small, you de-risk it, and then if it works, you've saved yourself a lot of time and money, and you're able to then roll it out more widely. And that's where the communication piece is so important, because that happens within departments and within brands, as people may say, oh, we had no idea that these other colleagues of ours already did this. And that's why it's so important to sort of have those forums for sharing the success and the failures as well, so that your colleagues don't waste time repeating the same mistakes.
But it's also one thing that I think is essential, like from the example and what you also said, is it's so extremely important with leadership buy-in to get these projects going. And then I like the part where you're saying that sort of like you need to be able to articulate what sort of challenge that you're trying to solve. But then what would you say, like, for those wanting to do this, like what are, like, from examples that you've seen, like how do you go about this to leadership and getting that buy-in?
It really helps when you have a member of leadership who is bought in or understands the urgency and importance of working with AI. And I think most C-level individuals at this point now really do. Maybe 2-3 years ago, not as much. Definitely now, I think it's on the agenda for everyone. So that makes things, in a sense, a little bit easier. But finding that champion and advocate is key. And in fact, the program that I worked on last year that I mentioned, one of the things that we always do actually is we require the team to identify what we call an executive sponsor. So you need that person who is in the leadership of your company that is going to be the sponsor of this project, and that's really key, because if it's a success, if the experiment's a success, the next conversation then becomes, we need the investment to scale this, to make it happen, and that senior individual in the company is probably going to be the one to help you take that to the next stage. So that's really important, finding that person who can be a support. I think it goes both ways though. It's like a top-down and a bottom-up conversation, because it's kind of on all of us to be experimenting with AI now in our day-to-day, in our personal work and the way that we're doing things. So I think that's one of the nice things about this, especially because it's a relatively new technology. A lot of times the people using it the most are more junior in the organization, younger in their careers, and maybe they come up with a really interesting idea and they can then be empowered to take that to their boss, say, I've been running this tool and getting these awesome results, check this out. So I think that's a nice thing, is it can be an agenda that is set from the top, but it can also be something that anyone has the power to shape.
But looking a little bit ahead and what comes next, I mean, you've been running this framework with the news publishers, and I really feels for me, like from what you said, that we moved past this phase of let's just try AI for the sake of it, and like the experimentation, and getting to sort of also get to understand like what's the value here. But what do you think newsrooms should be focusing on now from this? What's the next step?
So a lot of what we're talking about now with news organizations is almost like taking a step back and doing an audit of all the experimentation of the last 2 years, having a single source of truth of these are all the things that we tried, this is how they went, these are the projects that we're now going to take forward, or these are the projects we've already implemented that have become part of our business as usual. So I think that's one first step. The use case identification and everything that we did last year, I think that's a process that can remain always on, always happening. I don't think it stops, and I don't think we've found all the use cases already. So that's something that should be continuous in a sense, is always looking for ways to experiment further. But as you say, like we have a certain level of understanding now. The experimentation has been going on for 2+ years in some organizations. So now I think the key question after doing that sort of audit becomes ROI, return on investment. And that's what we're really focused on solving, both at the FT and for our clients now, is how can we accurately make decisions about which of these initiatives is the best use of AI and the best use of our team's time going forward. So no longer experimenting just for experimentation's sake, but really thinking quite shrewdly about what's going to bring the most value back to the business. So I think that's a big part of it. And then the other piece, which I mentioned, is around this future thinking piece of where is this all heading in terms of our business models and our industry. We're really lucky here in the sense that we have a head of policy, and it's literally his role is all about thinking about this and how are platforms changing, how is that going to be changing our relationship with readers and how they come in contact with our journalism and the information we're putting out there. But I think that kind of strategic piece of how to stay relevant, how to avoid disintermediation, all of these things, very, very important questions to be thinking about the next year, I think.
I find this conversation been so full of great nuggets, and like for a listener listening into this, and I'm sort of asking yourself, there's so much greater, but wondering where do I begin? What sort of one question they should ask themselves before diving into AI and AI use cases in the newsroom?
I think the first is this a problem? So it kind of goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. It's like, do I need AI for this? Is this actually a problem that I'm trying to solve for my business? If the answer is yes, then moving into, has this been done before, either in my organization or in the industry more broadly? What can I learn from their successes or failures? And what's great is that, as you mentioned, everyone's talking about AI all the time in our industry. So there is so much information out there, both from us, but also from many, many organizations, right, that are writing about what they're learning. And many organizations are encouraged to do that also to show that they are working with AI. So it's great for us because what it means is like there's so many case studies and there's so much sharing of information. But I do also think there's sometimes a bit of a lag with that because, as we discussed, this space is moving so fast and we only hear about certain stories a few months after they've occurred, right? So I think that's where I feel very lucky that I get to talk with a lot of people in real time about what they're doing today. And I always encourage people I'm working with to keep that peer group going. So a lot of the publications from last year, I believe they still talk to each other and sort of share that knowledge because this is happening on a day-to-day level, right? So we can't just talk about it every 6 months.
Now, I experience actually, if I were to go back 5-6 years ago, I think newsrooms and publishers were holding things closer to their chest. But I've been experiencing this extreme, and I'm very happy for this, very openness of sharing what they're doing. And I find it important that news publisher doesn't necessarily need to compete on technology or their way of doing things, but they can compete on the content. That's what they should be doing. I'm really, really happy that we had this conversation because I think it's full of nuggets, both in terms of how you should think about the three-way process that you did in the beginning. Also, the movement from like experimentation to asking what's valuable, the team structure about it, how to go about it, maybe if you're a bigger organization. So I think also the listener feels like there's full of nuggets here. And we have a closing sort of tradition in this podcast where the previous guest gets to leave a question for the new one. And the last guest that I had on the podcast was Tom Seaman, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of a niche media called On the Current News, who focus on the global seafood industry. And it's an absolute fantastic episode there, but it sort of tends with these questions to be very good in terms of the next question, because he had an AI question actually, and what his question was, which segment of the media do you think will be most open to disruption of AI? And in which sectors of media will most benefit from it? You can take your time. It's a very deep one.
It is a deep one. So it's interesting. I heard at a conference recently someone say that B2C has more to lose than B2B media because, you know, AI maybe is going to enable all these new data-rich experiences, whereas generalist news is maybe going to become increasingly commoditized and harder to make a destination, especially if people are increasingly just going to get the one line of information they need from a gen search platform. So I think there may be some truth to that. I think we still have to see on that one. However, in terms of, you know, I mentioned before, like we still don't have what I think is like the kind of killer use case for AI in news. So if we can find that, maybe we can unlock exciting value for just a classic B2C news provider. So we'll see on that. It's an interesting framing the way that they said who's most open to disruption. I don't know if anyone is open to disruption.
I also think like part of the question you did ask also, and I find this interesting because you said like you're scratching the surface right now of the iceberg of what we're doing with AI, but I think also it's interested to sort of like, is it who will sort of benefit? Is it the companies, the journalists, or both of them in terms of what's happening? And it's such a big question to think about.
Who will benefit? So you could argue that users will benefit because maybe they will, audiences will just receive the information they need much faster in a much more personalized way. But I kind of question whether that's what people want. Maybe I'm old-fashioned and I'm idealistic, but I wonder if that is going to be to the benefit of all audiences. Certainly there will be times where you really quickly need the answer to something, and I do think a lot of these emerging formats are great for that. So I think, for instance, as we were just saying, it's great in a professional context. So imagine, you're walking into a meeting and you just get exactly what you need in a few bullets. I probably should have done that with this question and I would have answered you like this. But equally, on the other hand, I don't think that's really how people behave. I think there are aspects to content and information that people like to savor that are more about taste. And that's why actually our weekend print publication here at the FT still in 2025 is still very popular because people like to just sit down with a slower news read and catch up on what happened over the week. So I don't think it's all going to be about speed. And that's why I think we need to think about use cases that are not just about getting information to the readers faster. The other people who stand to benefit perhaps are us, because I think maybe if I could end it on a controversial note, we've always been in the beginning viewing AI as this threat, right? Like we're so used to disruption in our industry. It's sort of like, oh, here comes another platform that's here to steal my lunch, or here comes another big wave of disruption. But maybe it's just also going to make us better and make us have to differentiate our content more, make us find things that we wouldn't have otherwise and tell more people's stories. Like the example you mentioned from the local newsroom, like a lot of those stories would never be told because no one just has the time to sit down and read all these local court documents. So I think that's really exciting, and that's something that inspires me, when I have those moments where I question everything and then I remember, actually, there is also some good that's going to come from this for journalism, I think.
I absolutely love that answer. You get to also ask a question for the next guest, not knowing who that person is. It's definitely somebody in the industry, but you're open to ask any question. It doesn't need to be also. It doesn't need to sort of also be where like in the industry specific, but you can ask what you want.
So they gave me a tough one. This is something that kind of fascinates me, and I think it's quite industry agnostic. So hopefully it works pretty well for your next guest. Something that concerns me is like the role of learning, because I was quite lucky in the sense that I had already been working for 8-9 years when all of these generative AI tools came onto the scene, right? But my concern is to look at the output of AI critically. You need to have had a certain level of training in the original way of doing things, right? So if you think about how do you check the copy that comes out, you can do that because you have a trained eye and a critical eye because you've grown up as an intern doing these things for your boss, right? If no one's doing those things because AI is doing it for us, how do we make sure the next generation of people know those foundational skills? That's something that concerns me, because a lot of the things that we give to our AI assistants are exactly the kind of things that were the perfect training ground. for journalists or young talent in any industry. So that's a question for the next person: is what do they think about that, and where do they see that challenge going with regard to development and talent development?
This is such a great question. I and our CEO at Kilkaya had exactly the same conversation here the other day, and it's so much of like the craft also in the newsroom. Like even, okay, this story is going well on analytics. Let's drive this article up high, or like that movement, or like just having something to do. Like the skill you're building up to is such a fascinating question to ask. I really like that. We're come to the end at the podcast, and I say again, this has been fantastic. There's so many great nuggets here in terms of how to go about it, and I really, really appreciate you joining and sharing your knowledge. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nils. Thank you for having me.